Dr. Jonathan Harper was arrested right in the parking lot of his own hospital simply because he was black. Little did they know, they were arresting the future head of the clinic. The public was outraged, and Harper himself decided to use the incident to expose the deep-rooted racism in the system. His next move would shock even those who had seen it all. But let's start from the beginning. Dr. Jonathan Harper was wrapping up a final call, discussing an upcoming surgery, when he tiredly exited through the back door of the city hospital. He glanced around the empty parking lot, savoring the rare moment of quiet after a hectic day. He still had a few hours of preparation ahead for tomorrow's board meeting, an important one, where he was set to be confirmed as the hospital's chief. Feeling slightly relaxed, he walked toward his car, taking a deep breath of the evening air. He reached into his pocket for his keys, but before he could unlock the door, a sharp voice interrupted. "Hey, you! What are you doing here?" A gruff voice barked from behind. Harper turned to see two police officers rapidly approaching him. One of them, Officer Markson, already had his hand on his belt, as if ready for action. Harper frowned, unsure of what was happening. "Excuse me?" he replied calmly, putting his keys back into his pocket. "I'm a doctor. I work here at the hospital." Markson stopped in front of him, staring at Harper as though assessing his every move. His partner stood a little farther back, watching the situation. "A doctor, huh?" Markson sneered. "Show me your ID. Hard to believe you're here for business." Harper, suppressing his growing irritation, calmly reached for his ID and handed it to the officer. "Here, I'm Dr. Jonathan Harper. I just finished the surgery and was about to go home," he said, maintaining eye contact with the officer. Markson gave the ID a cursory glance, smirked, and handed it back. "Doesn't seem like a doctor would park here. Don't you think that's a bit too fancy of a car for a simple doctor?" Markson mocked, eyeing Harper's vehicle. "And you seem a little too nervous." Harper attempted to explain. "This is just a misunderstanding. I really do work here. If necessary, we can go inside the hospital, and you can speak with my colleagues." But the officer seemed deaf to his words. He had already made up his mind. At that moment, Markson's partner stepped forward and pulled out handcuffs, preparing for the arrest. "Let's cut the chatter," Markson said, motioning for Harper to put out his hands. "Looks like we'll figure out who you are down at the station." People in the parking lot began to notice the situation. Some pulled out their phones to record what was happening. Harper felt the atmosphere around him thicken with injustice and humiliation. He tried to remain calm, but inside, anger was building. He couldn't believe that he, a well-known doctor, was being treated like a criminal just because of the color of his skin. "This is a misunderstanding," Harper firmly stated, though his voice was nearly drowned out by the growing murmurs of onlookers. The officers ignored his words and the situation quickly spiraled out of control. Dr. Harper tried to stay composed, but the weight of the injustice became heavier with each passing second. The officers had no intention of listening to his explanation. Officer Markson roughly pushed him against the car, forcefully pulling his arms behind his back. "Turn around! No sudden moves!" Markson ordered sharply, snapping the handcuffs into place. Harper felt the cold metal dig into his wrists. He tried to protest. "You're making a mistake! I'm Dr. Harper, a surgeon at this hospital. This is madness!" But Markson just smirked. "A doctor, huh? They all say that," he mocked. By now, the crowd of onlookers had grown, with people filming the incident on their phones. A passerby shouted, "Hey, do you even know who you're arresting?" The police officers ignored the growing outrage around them. Harper could feel his composure starting to crack. He made another attempt to explain. "I'm not a criminal. I have my documents. You can call the hospital and verify." Officer Markson waved him off dismissively. "We'll check the documents at the station. Enough talking." Meanwhile, the second officer noticed several people stepping closer, observing the scene. Someone in the crowd shouted, "That's Dr. Harper! We know him! He works here!" But the officers continued as if nothing had changed. Harper was resigned to the fact that he would be taken to the station, when suddenly, a figure appeared on the parking lot that would change everything. It was Laura Anderson, the hospital's chief physician. Seeing what was happening, she rushed over to the officers. "What is going on here? Are you out of your minds? This is Dr. Harper, head of the surgical department," she exclaimed. Markson froze for a moment, stunned as he looked at Laura. But then, trying to save face, he replied, "We received a report of a suspicious person, and we're just doing our job." "A suspicious person?" Laura retorted indignantly. "You didn't even bother to find out who he is, and you arrested a respected doctor. Take those handcuffs off him immediately." The crowd began to rally behind Laura, shouting in support. The officers exchanged glances, realizing they had made a serious mistake. Reluctantly, Markson removed the handcuffs from Harper and muttered a half-hearted apology. Freed from the handcuffs, Harper rubbed his sore wrists, but instead of exploding in anger, he quietly said, "This was completely unjustified. I'm not a criminal, and you knew that, but you still made this decision." Laura stood by his side, supporting him, while the gathered witnesses were already posting videos of the incident online. "Daughter." Harper realized that the situation was no longer just a personal incident. The video of his arrest spread with incredible speed, sparking public outrage not just in the city but across the country. The overwhelming support from people gave him strength, although he still felt the bitterness of the humiliation he had experienced. People saw him as a symbol of injustice, and he understood that he now had a responsibility to speak on behalf of those who face similar treatment every day. The next day, Laura Anderson, along with representatives from the hospital's administration, organized an emergency meeting with the legal team to discuss their next steps. The hospital's reputation was on the line, and she knew they couldn't let this incident destroy the public's trust. "We need to take a firm stance," Laura insisted during the meeting. "This cannot go without consequences. We must publicly support Dr. Harper and demand an investigation into the police's actions." "You're right," one of the lawyers replied. "We'll draft an official statement for the media and back Harper in this case. The public is already on our side, and we must use this moment to highlight the issue of systemic racism." Meanwhile, at the police station, a different kind of meeting was taking place. Officers Markson and his partner had been summoned to the chief's office. The atmosphere in the room was tense. The police chief, stern and disappointed, flipped through reports on the incident, while the video of the arrest played on every news channel. "This is a disaster," the chief began, without looking up from the documents. "Do you realize what you've done? This man isn't just innocent. He's a respected doctor, known throughout the city for saving lives." Officer Markson tried to defend himself, clearly attempting to save face. "We got a call about a suspicious person, and we followed protocol." "Protocol?" the chief interrupted sharply. "Your protocol is based on biased judgments. You didn't even give him a chance to explain, didn't properly check his documents. Now we're facing a citywide scandal, and believe me, this could cost you your career unless you take the right steps." Markson's partner remained silent, fully aware of the gravity of the situation. The mistakes were obvious, and they needed to be corrected, but public humiliation was inevitable. The chief continued, "You'll have to publicly apologize to Dr. Harper and his family. Otherwise, the public pressure and legal consequences could be far worse for both of you." Markson reluctantly nodded, realizing the situation had spiraled out of control. He hadn't expected the backlash to be this severe, and couldn't believe how serious the situation had become. Meanwhile, Harper and the hospital's team were preparing for a press conference, organized to provide an official response to the incident. It was not just an act of public statement, it was a fight for justice. Harper knew that not only his colleagues and patients were watching him, but thousands of people who had faced similar situations and never had their stories heard. As Harper stepped up to the podium, the flashes of cameras lit up his face. The room was silent, and everyone waited for his words. He took a deep breath and began to speak. "What happened to me is not an isolated incident. This is not just the mistake of a few individuals. It's a systemic problem that thousands of people across this country face every day. People, like me, are judged not for their actions, but for the color of their skin, for their appearance. I never imagined I'd become part of this issue, but it happened, and now I must speak about it." His voice was calm but filled with determination, and every sentence carried the weight of the humiliation he had endured. He continued, "I am not the only one who has gone through this. Many black men and women face injustice every day, but their stories go unnoticed. We cannot stay silent when we are judged by biased perceptions, and we must fight for change. This is not just a fight for my name, it's a fight for everyone who has ever faced injustice." His words were met with a thunderous round of applause. The journalists in the room were recording every word, and the video streams were already gaining thousands of views. Harper saw his colleagues from the hospital nodding in support. The hospital also announced that it would develop and implement programs to train staff on racial discrimination and ensure fair treatment for all patients. That day marked the beginning of significant changes, not only in the hospital, but also in public consciousness. A few days later, public pressure had mounted to the point where the police department was forced to hold a press conference. Officers Markson and his partner, visibly shaken by the ongoing events, stepped up to face the cameras. Markson, who had once acted with confidence and authority, now looked embarrassed. He took the microphone and, trying to maintain composure, said, "I sincerely apologize to Dr. Harper and his family for the recent incident. It was a misunderstanding, and our actions were wrong. We will do everything possible to ensure this does not happen again." His words were unconvincing, and the room remained filled with tension. Journalists began asking questions, trying to determine what consequences the officers would face. However, despite the apology, the public demanded more. The video of the incident continued to spread online, sparking nationwide discussions. Harper closely followed the developments, understanding that his story had become a symbol of the fight against systemic discrimination. Along with his colleagues and lawyers, he began planning the next steps. It was soon announced that the hospital, in partnership with community activists, would organize a major town hall meeting to discuss issues of racial justice and police reform. When the day of the meeting arrived, the hall was packed. People from across the city, media representatives, and community leaders gathered to hear from Harper and other speakers. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation for change. Harper once again took the podium, but this time he looked more confident. "Today, I'm not here to talk about my personal story," he began, looking around the room. "I'm here to call all of us to action. We must acknowledge that systemic racism exists, and it affects every one of us, whether we are doctors, police officers, or everyday citizens. This is not an isolated incident. This is the reality we face every day." His words were met with applause, but he continued. "Apologies are the first step, but that's not enough. We must push for real change. We need to change the system so that no one else ever has to experience the humiliation and injustice based on the color of their skin." After him, other community leaders spoke, sharing their stories and proposals. The entire city united in the fight for reform, and this meeting marked the beginning of a major movement. The police promised additional training for their officers and increased oversight to prevent similar incidents in the future. Harper felt a sense of satisfaction, but he knew there was still much work to be done. He had no intention of stopping. His story now served as a beacon for everyone fighting injustice. Instead of being crushed by the pressure, he used the incident as an opportunity to become a voice for change. As the meeting ended, Harper stepped outside. Passers-by who recognized him approached, thanking him for his courage and expressing their support. He realized that his fight had grown beyond a personal struggle. It had become the cause of an entire community.